In the small town of Ashbrook, nestled among dense woods and winding hills, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the deserted streets. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of a building or the distant call of a crow. But it wasn't the peaceful quiet one would expect after a long day. It was the eerie stillness of a town on the brink of destruction. Ashbrook had once been a quiet, thriving community, known for its tight-knit families and friendly neighbors. But that was before the outbreak, before the world changed. Now, the town was a battleground, where the remaining survivors fought every day to stay alive against an ever-growing horde of zombies. Among the survivors was a diverse group of individuals: Emily, a determined high school teacher; Jack, a former soldier with a haunted past; Sarah, a resourceful mechanic; and Thomas, a young boy whose parents had been lost in the early days of the outbreak. They had found each other by chance and, over the course of weeks, had become more like family than just strangers thrown together by circumstance. But despite their efforts to stay safe, their supplies were dwindling. The small grocery store was empty. The water tower had been drained. And the town's only source of power, the nearby hydroelectric plant, was slowly being overtaken by the undead. The survivors knew they had to do something, but the clock was ticking. If they didn't act soon, Ashbrook would fall to the horde, and their last chance at survival would be gone. As night fell, the group gathered in the basement of the old town hall. The walls were lined with maps, weapons, and a makeshift kitchen. A large table at the center of the room was cluttered with notes, plans, and a single, glowing flashlight that illuminated their faces in a dim, eerie light. Tension hung thick in the air. "We need to make a stand," Jack said, his voice low but firm. His fingers drummed on the table, impatience in his eyes. "We can't just hide out forever. We need to take back the power plant." Sarah looked over at the map of the town, her brow furrowed. "It's not going to be easy. The zombies are already swarming around the plant, and it's a dangerous path. We've lost people trying to make it there before." Emily, ever the voice of reason, stepped in. "But we can't keep running. We need power to survive. Without it, we'll freeze when winter hits. And we'll have nothing to defend ourselves with." Thomas, who had been silently listening, looked up. "What if we can't do it? What if we're not strong enough?" His voice was filled with fear, but there was also an undercurrent of hope. He was a boy who had seen his world crumble, but he still believed there was a chance to fight for something better. Jack stood up and walked over to him. "We're stronger together than apart. We fight for each other. That's how we win." The group fell silent, each member lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their decision hung over them like a storm cloud. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for their future. As the conversation turned to strategy, a low rumble echoed from outside. The faint sound of shuffling feet grew louder, and the floor trembled as the horde drew near. Emily's heart raced, but she tried to stay calm. The moment had come. They had to act, and they had to act now. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. "We go tomorrow at first light. We fight for Ashbrook, and we fight for our future." The survivors gathered their weapons and supplies, each one knowing that they might not make it back. But they also knew that if they didn't try, there would be no future left to fight for. As they set their plan into motion, a sense of unity and purpose filled the room. They were no longer just survivors, they were a team, and they would fight together to reclaim what was theirs. The first light of dawn broke through the cracked windows of the basement, casting long shadows across the room. The survivors stood together, their hearts beating in unison, ready for the battle ahead. The first rays of sunlight barely pierced the heavy clouds as the survivors gathered outside the town hall. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath their boots was wet with the remnants of an overnight rain. Their eyes were determined, but there was an unspoken fear among them. They were about to face something far worse than they had ever encountered, a horde of zombies, hungry and relentless, surrounding the power plant. "Stay close," Jack instructed, his voice sharp. He motioned for Sarah to lead the way, knowing her mechanical skills would come in handy should they run into trouble on the road. Emily, with her calm demeanor, positioned herself at the rear, ready to provide support if needed, while Thomas clung to her side, a small rifle slung over his shoulder. The group moved as one, each step echoing the gravity of the situation. The path to the power plant was treacherous, winding through dense woods that had long since been abandoned by the living. The survivors kept their eyes peeled for any signs of movement, every rustle in the leaves sending a chill down their spines. Every corner, every shadow could hide danger. But they had no choice. They had to keep going. As they neared the outskirts of town, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder. Sarah held up a hand, signaling them to stop. She crouched low and scanned the area, her sharp eyes catching a glimpse of the first wave of zombies. A group of 6 staggered down the road ahead, their grotesque forms barely recognizable as human. Their eyes were dull, their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by an unseen force. "They're not far behind," Sarah whispered. "We need to move quickly." But just as they prepared to advance, a loud crash echoed from a nearby building. The survivors froze. The noise had come from the direction of the power plant. "They've already started breaking through," Jack muttered under his breath, his knuckles white around the grip of his rifle. "We need to hurry. They'll be on us soon." The survivors pushed forward, hearts pounding, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They reached the edge of the town, and from there, the power plant was visible in the distance, a hulking silhouette against the gray sky. The plant had been Ashbrook's lifeblood, its tall smokestacks once a symbol of industry and progress. Now, it was a fortress for the undead. As they moved closer, the streets grew more chaotic. The sound of moaning and shrieks pierced the air, and more zombies appeared, blocking their path. The survivors ducked behind a crumbling wall, trying to stay out of sight. "We're surrounded," Sarah said, her voice strained. "There's no easy way in. The horde's everywhere." Jack gritted his teeth. "We'll have to fight our way through." "Wait," Emily said, her voice calm but with a hint of urgency. "There's a maintenance tunnel on the east side of the plant. It might be a way in, but it's risky." The group exchanged wary glances. The tunnel was their only shot, but it would also lead them right into the heart of the zombie-infested plant. There was no turning back once they entered. "We do it," Jack said with finality. "We're already in this deep. We go through the tunnel." The survivors made their way to the eastern side of the power plant, moving as silently as possible. The closer they got, the stronger the stench of decay grew. It was overwhelming, a foul mix of rot and decay that made their stomachs churn. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a stack of old crates, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Sarah pried open the rusted metal door, and the group stepped into the dark, narrow passage. The air inside was stale, and the ground was slick with water. The faint sound of scraping and groaning echoed through the walls, the unmistakable noise of the undead lurking just beyond their reach. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered as he led the way, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. "We can't risk alerting them." The tunnel twisted and turned, making it difficult to keep track of their progress. The further they went, the more it felt like they were descending into a nightmare. But there was no turning back. As they approached the main section of the power plant, they could hear the unmistakable sounds of zombies, groaning, stumbling, and scraping against metal. The survivors pressed themselves into the shadows, trying to make themselves as small and inconspicuous as possible. The tunnel ahead of them was lined with pipes, some of them burst open, leaking a foul-smelling liquid. The air was thick with a sense of impending danger. Thomas, who had been remarkably quiet, whispered nervously, "What if they find us? What if?" A loud crash echoed through the tunnel, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. A group of zombies appeared at the far end, their forms emerging from the darkness like shadows. The survivors froze, holding their breath. The creatures were moving slowly, but they were relentless. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, their mouths hanging open, drooling with hunger. They were close, too close. Jack motioned for the group to stay still, his eyes narrowing as the zombies came closer. Every nerve in his body was on edge. They couldn't afford to be seen now. As the creatures passed them, barely a few feet away, Emily held Thomas's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't move, couldn't breathe, not until the zombies were out of sight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the zombies shuffled past, and the group exhaled collectively. They continued their journey, deeper into the darkness of the plant. Their goal was within reach, but the real battle was just beginning. The survivors pressed on through the darkened tunnel, their footsteps muffled against the damp concrete floor. The stench of decay was unbearable, growing stronger as they ventured deeper into the heart of the power plant. Their eyes adjusted to the dim light from a single flickering bulb, casting long shadows against the grimy walls. The echoes of distant groans and the unsettling scraping sounds of the undead filled the air, reminding them that they were never truly alone. "We're almost there," Jack whispered, his voice low and tense. He had been leading the way, his every sense on high alert. Emily and Thomas followed closely behind, while Sarah kept an eye on their rear, her fingers lightly brushing the handle of her knife, ready for anything. The fear of the unknown loomed heavy in their minds, but there was no turning back now. They were committed. As they reached the end of the tunnel, the survivors saw a heavy, rusted door that led to the central control room of the power plant. The door was ajar, and through the crack, they could hear the unmistakable sounds of zombies moving about. The room was filled with their growls and moans, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. "This is it," Sarah murmured. "We've got to move fast." Jack nodded, signaling for them to take their positions. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The power plant was the key to their survival, and they had to act now if they wanted to keep their town safe. They quietly approached the door, trying to stay as silent as possible. Jack peeked inside, his breath catching in his throat. The sight that greeted him was worse than he had anticipated. The control room was a nightmare. Zombies were scattered throughout the space, some feeding on the remains of those who had once worked there, others aimlessly stumbling around in search of prey. The room was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the rancid smell of death. "There's too many of them," Jack muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the grip of his rifle. "We can't take them all on." "We don't have a choice," Emily said, her voice resolute. "We need to get to the control panel. If we don't, Ashbrook is as good as gone." Jack looked at her, his expression hardening. He knew she was right. The survival of the town rested on them gaining control of the plant's systems. The generators that powered the town's electricity were located in this room, and without them, they wouldn't last through the coming winter. "We move in 3, Jack said, his voice low. He glanced at the others, his eyes meeting Emily's. There was no time for fear now, only action. "Sarah, cover the left side. Emily, you and Thomas stick close. I'll take the right." The plan was simple, but it was risky. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The group burst through the door, their weapons raised. Jack fired first, taking down 2 zombies that had been closest to the door. The loud gunshots echoed in the confined space, drawing the attention of the rest of the undead in the room. The survivors didn't hesitate. They moved with practiced precision, shooting, stabbing, and dodging as the zombies rushed toward them with terrifying speed. Sarah's knife flashed as she slashed through the air, taking down one zombie after another with ruthless efficiency. Emily fired her rifle, aiming carefully at the heads of the approaching zombies, while Thomas, with his heart pounding in his chest, shot wildly, but with surprising accuracy. The room was chaos, gunfire, screams, and the grotesque sounds of the undead filled the air. The survivors fought with everything they had, but it was clear that the odds were not in their favor. More zombies were pouring in from the hallways, their numbers growing by the second. "We need to get to the control panel," Jack shouted over the noise. "Now!" They made their way through the room, moving toward the far corner where the control panel was located. But just as they reached it, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The survivors turned, their eyes widening in shock. A new wave of zombies had emerged from the hallway, trapping them in the room. The door was now barricaded, and they were surrounded. "Great," Sarah muttered, wiping blood from her face. "Just what we needed." The situation was dire, but Jack remained focused. "We can't panic," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll find a way out. We just need to buy some time." The survivors backed into a corner, their weapons drawn. Emily looked at the control panel, the blinking lights and switches seeming like the only hope for escape. But it was covered in blood, and the damage from the zombies' earlier attacks had left the panel partially destroyed. It was unclear whether it could still function. Thomas tugged at Emily's sleeve. "Can you fix it?" Emily's eyes flicked over the panel, calculating her options. She nodded. "I'll try, but we'll need a few minutes. Cover me." With the clock ticking, the survivors held their ground. Zombies were pressing in from every side, their clawed hands reaching toward them. Jack fired at a few of the closest ones, but there were too many. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his heart racing in his chest. As Emily worked desperately on the control panel, Sarah and Jack fought back the horde, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. But every moment that passed felt like an eternity. The air was thick with tension, and the survivors knew that they couldn't hold out forever. With a final, desperate push, Emily slammed her hand down on a lever. The lights in the room flickered, and a loud hum filled the air. The power plant had come back to life. But it was too late. The door to the room burst open, and the zombies surged forward. The room erupted in chaos as the power flickered back on. The hum of the plant's machinery reverberated through the walls, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sound of growls and the shuffling of countless zombies flooding into the control room. The survivors were pinned against the corner, their backs to the wall. There was no way out, at least, not the easy way. "Move, move, move!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse from the tension. His fingers clenched around his rifle, his eyes scanning the room for any way to escape. The door behind them had been barricaded by the relentless tide of zombies, and now it was only a matter of time before the undead would close in on them from all directions. But the hum of the power plant's restart was their only hope. "Cover me!" Emily yelled, not wasting a second. She dove into the now active control panel, fingers flying across the cracked console. She had no idea if it would work, but she had to try. If they didn't regain control of the plant, Ashbrook's days were numbered. Jack and Sarah moved as one, using their weapons to hold back the oncoming tide. Jack fired with precision, his shots cutting down zombies in rapid succession. But every time he took one down, two more seemed to take its place. Sarah, ever the strategist, flanked him, her knife cutting through the air as she expertly took down one zombie after another, her movements smooth and practiced. "Thomas, stay with Emily," Jack ordered, his voice carrying over the battle's noise. Thomas nodded, his wide eyes filled with fear, but determination flashing through his gaze. He turned to Emily, his hand gripping his rifle tightly as he moved to her side, ready to protect her at all costs. "Get it working, Emily," Thomas shouted, his voice filled with urgency as he scanned the room for any threats. Zombies were getting closer. He could hear their grotesque moans as they grew more eager. "I'm trying." Emily's voice cracked as she frantically pushed buttons, hoping for a miracle. She pulled a lever down with all her might, hoping it would activate some sort of defensive mechanism. The machines in the plant whirred and buzzed, but the zombies were getting closer. Sarah threw herself into the fray, her movements fluid and deadly. She was quick, too quick for the zombies to catch, slashing through their grotesque forms with deadly precision. Jack was by her side, shooting, then reloading, never stopping, always keeping the pressure on the horde. Their coordination was seamless. But even they couldn't fight forever. A loud screeching sound filled the room as one of the zombies lunged at Sarah. She barely had time to react before it was on her, its teeth snapping dangerously close. Jack fired his rifle, but the shot went wide. Without thinking, Sarah threw the blade of her knife directly at the undead creature, hitting it in the eye. It fell to the ground with a sickening thud. "I'm out," Jack shouted, throwing his empty rifle aside as he unsheathed a heavy combat knife from his belt. It was time for close combat. He moved to Sarah's side, slashing at any zombies who came too close. In the midst of the chaos, Emily's face lit up for a brief moment. "Got it," she exclaimed, her voice filled with relief. The power plant's lights flickered brightly as the systems roared to life. The huge generators in the corner hummed, and a deep bass sound vibrated through the floor. A loud clanging echoed as a massive metal door slammed down over the entrance, sealing off the zombies from the control room. The survivors let out a collective sigh of relief, but they knew this was only temporary. The zombies were still out there, still overwhelming the town, but for the moment, they were safe. The survivors quickly turned to face the door. It wasn't going to hold for long. "We've bought ourselves some time," Jack said through gritted teeth. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. "But this won't last. We need to get to the other side of the plant." "We're not out of the woods yet," Sarah agreed, her voice tight. She wiped blood off her knife, her face grim. "But at least we've stopped the bleeding for now." Emily nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her. She knew they couldn't waste time celebrating the small victory. The town was still at risk, and the horde was still out there, growing by the hour. "We need to keep moving," she said. "If we don't get to the backup generators in the West Wing, everything we've done will be for nothing. This plant can't just be activated once, it needs to be stabilized." Jack nodded. "We move in 5 minutes. Get your gear together, we head out." They gathered their things quickly, adrenaline still pumping through their veins, preparing for the next leg of their journey. Emily checked her rifle, Sarah sharpened her knife, and Thomas double-checked the ammunition in his pack. As the survivors prepared to leave the control room, a distant, echoing roar sounded through the power plant, sending a wave of dread over them. "They're coming," Jack said, his jaw clenched. "Let's go." The survivors exited the room, their eyes scanning the dark hallways, the dim lights casting long, eerie shadows. They had a mission now: get to the backup generators and stabilize the power grid. But the zombies were closing in, and time was running out. "Stay close," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're not done yet." And with that, they moved deeper into the plant, knowing that their fight for survival was far from over. The air in the power plant was heavy, thick with the smell of oil, metal, and decay. The survivors moved swiftly, their eyes darting around the darkened corridors as the soft hum of the generators reverberated beneath their feet. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hide something more sinister, and yet, they had no choice but to press forward. There was no turning back now. The fate of Ashbrook, and their own survival, rested on what they did next. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead. The dim lighting was sporadic, and in some areas, the flickering bulbs created an almost nightmarish atmosphere. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that coursed through him. They had bought themselves some time by sealing the control room, but the clock was ticking. The backup generators in the West Wing were their only hope. "How far to the backup?" Emily asked, her voice tense as she adjusted her rifle and kept an eye on their rear. "Not far," Jack replied. He paused, checking the map he'd memorized earlier. The backup generators were located on the far end of the plant, through a series of narrow maintenance corridors. The path wasn't easy, but it was the quickest route. "We've got a clear shot if we stick to the left side. But we have to move fast. The power's only going to hold for so long before the zombies find their way back inside." Sarah nodded, her face grim. "Then we don't waste time." She checked her knife again, making sure it was within easy reach. "Let's move." The group proceeded through the winding hallways, their footsteps barely making a sound. Every creak of the metal beams above seemed louder than it actually was. Jack's instincts screamed at him to be ready. Every step they took could lead to an ambush. They couldn't afford to drop their guard. They reached a narrow hallway that led to the main corridor to the West Wing, but as they rounded the corner, they came face to face with a barricade of overturned crates and broken machinery. The path was blocked, and it looked like someone had tried to fortify the area in a last-ditch effort to hold back the horde. "This wasn't here before," Thomas muttered, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Someone else must have been through here." Jack surveyed the barricade for a moment before turning back to his group. "It doesn't matter. We need to get past it. They worked together quickly to move the debris, pushing aside the rusted crates and metal scrap. It wasn't long before they made a gap just wide enough for them to squeeze through. The tension was unbearable as each of them crawled through, but there was no time for hesitation. They couldn't afford to be slowed down. Just as Emily was about to crawl through last, a shrill scream echoed from the other side of the hallway. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew louder, more intense. "They're coming!" Sarah yelled, her voice urgent. The sound of heavy footsteps, followed by the unmistakable growl of the undead, grew louder by the second. The survivors turned to see a group of zombies stumbling down the hallway, attracted by the noise of their struggle. Their eyes were vacant, their skin decayed, and their movements erratic, but they were still fast, faster than they had hoped for. "Run!" Jack shouted. Without thinking, the survivors bolted through the narrow gap, their hearts pounding in their chests. Jack was the first to make it through, turning to see the others following closely behind. They couldn't afford to be caught in a corner. They needed to keep moving. Emily was next, followed by Thomas. But Sarah was momentarily held back as she struggled to climb through the narrow gap. The zombies were gaining ground fast. "Sarah, hurry!" Jack yelled, his voice filled with urgency. With one last push, Sarah squeezed through just as the first zombie reached the barricade. It roared in frustration as it swiped at her, its clawed hands missing her by inches. She scrambled to her feet, panting and breathless, but she was free. "Go, go, go!" she cried, pushing forward. The group moved as quickly as they could, but the zombies were close behind. They could hear the shuffling footsteps, the growls of the undead getting louder with every passing second. As they entered the west wing of the plant, the hallway widened, but the space was eerily quiet, too quiet. The faint hum of the generators in the distance was the only sound that filled the silence, but it did little to calm the survivors' nerves. Jack paused for a moment, scanning the area. The hallway stretched on, the doors to the backup generators only a few hundred feet ahead, but they still had to get past whatever obstacles lay in between. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice low. "But we need to move carefully. We can't risk attracting more of them." The survivors crept forward, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Every movement seemed amplified in the silence, and every creak of the floor beneath their feet made them freeze in place. Jack's grip tightened on his weapon. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. As they moved toward the door to the generator room, Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the door to the generator room creaked open. The door to the generator room creaked open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning as it swung wide. A stale, metallic smell filled the air, the sound of the machinery humming in the distance. But there was something unsettling about the silence that followed. The survivors paused, their eyes wide with caution, their hands tightening around their weapons. Jack motioned for them to stay quiet as he edged closer to the entrance. The room beyond was large, filled with industrial-sized generators that whirred and buzzed in their rhythmic, mechanical lullaby. But it was also empty, eerily empty. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," Jack replied, his brow furrowed as he scanned the room. "But it's the only way. We need to stabilize the power." Emily, gripping her rifle tightly, nodded. "Let's do this." They moved forward cautiously, taking careful steps across the cold concrete floor. The heavy, clanking sound of their boots reverberated through the cavernous space, but the generators continued to hum, a mechanical heartbeat in the distance. It was almost as if the place had been abandoned, or worse, intentionally left untouched. The survivors couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. As they neared the control panel near the far wall, a strange sound broke the quiet. It was subtle at first, just a soft scrape of metal against concrete. But then it came again, louder this time. Jack froze, his hand held up to signal for silence. The others did the same, their eyes darting around the room. "Did anyone else hear that?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, the scraping sound grew louder, followed by a low, guttural growl. The survivors exchanged terrified glances, realizing they weren't alone. Something, or someone, was in the shadows, lurking just beyond their sight. "I knew it," Sarah hissed, her knife drawn. "We're not alone." Suddenly, from the darkness between two large generators, a figure emerged. It was a person, sort of. The survivor's eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had a sickly, pale hue. His clothes were torn, and his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet on a string. It wasn't a zombie in the traditional sense, but it was something worse, something more terrifying. "Get ready," Jack whispered, his voice low and steady. "Stay close." The figure shuffled toward them, its head tilting at odd angles, its lips curling back in a grotesque grin. As it moved closer, they could see the grotesque details more clearly. Its body was contorted, with its ribs clearly visible beneath stretched skin. It wasn't a full-fledged zombie, this was something new, something different. "Is that one of us?" Thomas asked, his voice quivering in disbelief. "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "That's something worse. They're evolving." Before anyone could react, more figures emerged from the shadows, half-human, half-monster creatures with grotesque, malformed bodies. Their eyes glinted with hunger, but there was something else in them too, an intelligence, a twisted awareness that made them even more dangerous than the mindless zombies that usually roamed the world. "They're not just zombies," Jack said through gritted teeth. "They're becoming something else. Something smarter." The creatures charged, moving with startling speed for their disjointed, twisted forms. Jack and Sarah fired immediately, but their shots only slowed the creatures down, didn't stop them. Emily reached for her gun, her heart pounding in her chest, but her hand was trembling. This was different. This wasn't a fight against mindless flesh-eaters. This was a fight against something more calculated, more determined. Sarah slashed with her knife, narrowly dodging one creature's outstretched claws. It growled, its mouth dripping with a sickly saliva, before lunging again. With a quick flick of her wrist, Sarah buried her blade deep into the creature's throat. But it didn't go down immediately. It staggered back, eyes filled with rage, and then charged again. "Keep moving!" Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We have to get to the control panel. We don't have time to fight them all." The survivors dashed forward, using the generators as cover as they made their way to the control panel. Behind them, the mutated creatures shrieked and howled, their movements erratic as they hunted their prey. Emily reached the control panel first, her fingers flying over the buttons, trying to find the override. The power surges in the plant had destabilized the system, and she had to stabilize it manually. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she glanced nervously at the approaching creatures. She could hear them getting closer. "Just a little longer," Emily muttered, her heart racing as she punched in the codes. The screen flickered, and the lights in the room blinked before stabilizing. The backup generators hummed louder, and the room seemed to shake with the force of the surge. "It's working," she shouted. But as the last creature lunged toward her, Jack fired, taking it down in one swift shot. The other creatures hesitated for a moment, confused by the unexpected turn of events. It was enough for the survivors to make their move. "Go, go, go!" Jack shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the exit. They had bought themselves time, but it wouldn't last long. They had to escape, now. The survivors sprinted out of the room, adrenaline fueling their every step. The echoes of the creatures' screams grew fainter as they reached the safety of the hallway. But they knew they weren't out of danger yet. The real battle was just beginning. The survivors burst into the hallway, breathless and shaken from the close encounter. They had barely escaped the mutated creatures in the generator room, but there was no time to rest. The noise of their hurried escape was already drawing attention. In the distance, the sound of shuffling feet and low growls grew louder. The zombies were still on their tail, and now, with the new threats in play, things had escalated beyond what they had expected. Jack motioned for them to move quickly but cautiously. "We need to get to the armory. It's not far from here, and we need more firepower." We can't keep doing this with just knives and a couple of guns. Emily nodded, adjusting her rifle and checking the ammo in her side pouch. What about the others? She asked, her voice tense. What about the rest of the town? We keep going, Jack said, his tone resolute. The town is counting on us, but we can't help them if we're dead. The group moved with precision, their footsteps muffled by the thick concrete walls. They passed through narrow corridors, each corner bringing new uncertainty. Every door they passed, every open space felt like a potential ambush. But as they approached the armory, the tension in the air seemed to thicken, as though something was waiting for them just beyond the door. Ready? Jack asked, his voice a low whisper. Everyone nodded. Emily stepped up, her hand resting on the handle of the door. She could feel her pulse racing, but she had to stay focused. She had to keep it together for the others. Slowly, she turned the handle and pushed the door open, revealing the armory. Inside, the air smelled of metal, gunpowder, and oil, an entirely different kind of danger than they had faced so far. Racks of weapons lined the walls, from assault rifles to handguns, to ammunition that could make a difference in a fight for survival. But as the door swung open, it became clear they weren't alone. Sitting in the corner of the armory, seemingly unfazed by their entrance, was another survivor, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a makeshift tactical vest. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, but he didn't look like he was one of the mutated monsters. Still, there was something off about him. He wasn't armed, but the way he held himself suggested he had seen too much to be sane. Who the hell are you? Sarah demanded, her grip tightening on her knife. She stepped forward cautiously. The man looked up slowly, his face unshaven and worn. A faint smile cracked on his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm the one who warned you, he said, his voice gravelly. You should have listened. Warned us about what? Jack asked, his tone sharp. He was tired, frustrated, and this stranger was not helping matters. You've made it this far, the man continued, rising to his feet with slow, deliberate movements. But you're too late. The town's already lost. You can't save it. Not from them. The air in the room grew thick with unease. Emily stepped closer, eyes scanning the racks of weapons. The man was clearly unhinged, but what he was saying sent a chill down her spine. Jack didn't hesitate. If you're done talking, we need to load up and get moving. We're not giving up yet. But before anyone could react, the loud bang of a distant explosion shook the walls, followed by the deafening roar of the undead. The noise was unmistakable, the sound of a breach. The town was under full assault now. They could hear the screams echoing from the streets, the panicked cries of the townsfolk as they tried to fend off the relentless horde. They're here, the man said with a cold smile. And it's already too late. You're all doomed. The survivors exchanged worried glances. This was the moment they had feared, the tipping point they had been rushing toward. They had to move fast, or they would be part of the mass of humanity left behind. No, Jack said firmly. We're not doomed. Not today. He grabbed an assault rifle from the rack and tossed it to Thomas. Then he moved to the shelves, picking up additional magazines and grenades, handing them off to the others. Emily found a tactical vest and pulled it on, tightening the straps. She wasn't going to let fear dictate the outcome. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The man in the corner watched them with a smirk, but Jack ignored him. They didn't have time for this. The real fight was outside, and it was coming for them fast. Stay close, Jack ordered. We stick together. We fight our way out of here. The group moved out of the armory, their weapons ready, but the minute they stepped back into the hallway, the situation shifted from tense to chaos. The sound of the undead grew louder. Zombies were swarming the hallways, stumbling toward the survivors with terrifying speed. But it wasn't just zombies. The mutated creatures from the generator room were with them, leading the charge, directing the mindless hordes like they were the leaders of this attack. This is it, Sarah said under her breath. They're taking the fight to us. We'll give them one hell of a fight, Jack replied, his voice hard. He raised his rifle and aimed. The first wave of zombies stumbled toward them, but this time, the survivors were ready. They fought through the throng of undead, their weapons flashing with precision. But the mutated creatures weren't far behind. They were faster, smarter, and more dangerous. They dodged gunfire and attacked with brutal force, taking down anything that stood in their way. The survivors fired, reloaded, and fought with everything they had, but it was clear that the fight was far from over. The odds were against them, but they weren't about to give up. They had one shot. They would either survive together, or they would fall together. The sound of battle echoed throughout the town. The survivors had made it to the heart of the town square, the only place left with some semblance of defense. But it was clear now, this was the final stand. The once bustling streets were now filled with the horrific sounds of the undead, shuffling, growling, and shrieking in a maddening chorus. Jack, Emily, Sarah, and Thomas stood together, their backs to the old fountain that still stood in the center of the square. They were surrounded by a mix of zombies and mutated creatures, each more dangerous than the last. There was no escape now. Their only option was to hold the line. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his eyes scanning the area. "We need to find a way to end this, before it's too late." Emily was already strategizing, her mind racing. "We have to use the environment. The old courthouse is still standing. It's got high walls, narrow entrances. If we can make our way inside, we can fortify it." "That's a good idea," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But we'll have to push through this mess first." The undead were closing in on them, their numbers seemingly endless. The mutated creatures led the charge, their twisted forms moving with an eerie intelligence. They didn't just want to kill, they wanted to make the survivors suffer, to break them down before the end. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen. "We fight our way to the courthouse," he said. "That's our only chance. On my mark." Before he could finish his sentence, one of the mutated creatures lunged at them with terrifying speed. It slashed through the air with its razor-sharp claws, forcing Sarah to jump back to avoid the strike. She landed hard on the ground, but before she could get up, the creature was on her, its jaws snapping. Without thinking, Thomas dove toward the creature, swinging his rifle like a club. The impact sent the creature stumbling back, giving Sarah the chance to regain her footing and stab her knife into the creature's exposed neck. It let out a sickening screech as it crumpled to the ground, its body twitching before going still. "Nice move," Jack said, glancing over at Thomas, but his words were quickly drowned out by the relentless growls of the approaching horde. The group began moving, pushing through the crowd of undead with brutal efficiency. They fired when necessary, but their main focus was reaching the courthouse. Each step was harder than the last, and the weight of their exhaustion was beginning to show. But they couldn't stop now. They wouldn't stop. As they neared the steps of the courthouse, the ground beneath them trembled with the force of an explosion. The gates to the courthouse suddenly burst open, and standing there, blocking their way, was a figure they hadn't expected to see, someone they thought they had left behind. It was the stranger from the armory. He stood there, a wild gleam in his eyes, and in his hands, he held a massive, crude weapon, a makeshift spear made of broken pipes and metal shards. His body was covered in dirt, and his breathing was labored, but there was something unmistakably dangerous about him now. He had joined the horde. "You shouldn't have come here," the man spat, his voice twisted with madness. "The town is mine now. You're just delaying the inevitable." Jack's heart sank, but his resolve hardened. "You've lost your mind. We're not here to fight you. We're here to survive. And if you're in the way of that, you're going down." The man laughed, a low, eerie chuckle that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand up. "You think you can win? You think you can stop it? There's no stopping the end." Jack, not wasting any more time on words, lunged forward with his rifle, taking a shot at the man. The bullet hit him in the shoulder, sending him staggering back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he charged forward, weapon raised, and it was clear he was ready to fight to the death. The others opened fire, but the man's madness had made him unpredictable. He ducked, weaved, and attacked with ferocity, driven by some twisted idea of control. He swung the spear, forcing the survivors to back up. He was stronger than they had anticipated, and for a moment, they found themselves struggling to keep him at bay. But then, just as quickly as the fight had started, it was over. With a swift move, Emily shot the man in the chest, her aim true. The man's eyes went wide, and he dropped the spear, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. He didn't move again. The survivors stood there for a moment, catching their breath. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The undead were still everywhere, and their numbers seemed to grow by the second. But they had one more chance to survive. "We keep moving," Jack said, determination in his voice. "We fight for this town. For everyone who's left." The survivors nodded in agreement. They had come this far. They weren't about to give up now. As they made their way into the courthouse, they slammed the doors shut behind them. It was only a temporary refuge, but it was enough. For now, they had a fighting chance. But they knew this was just the beginning of a much longer battle. The future of the town, and of humanity, was still uncertain. But as they stood together, facing the next wave of threats, one thing was certain: they would fight to the very end. And with that, the epic struggle of the survivors battling against the undead reaches its conclusion, at least for now. Would you like to explore any other story ideas or topics further?